Good evening. My name is Amy Lizer, and I am the Executive Director of the Monroe County Historical Association, and I am delighted that you have joined us for our August 3rd Thursday lecture series. We're going to get started here, but a few details. At the bottom of your screen, you will find a menu bar and the controls to submit questions via the Q&A function. We ask that you use this Q&A function to post all of your comments and questions for tonight's speaker. Posting the questions in the Q&A will help us keep track of them and be able to ask them after the presentation. Now, questions can be asked anytime throughout the program, but like I said, we are going to wait until the end to ask all of your questions for you. Now, without any further delay, I'm very happy to welcome tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Josh Loomis. A little bit about Dr. Loomis. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so you can start sharing yours, Josh. Joshua Loomis, PhD, is a microbiologist and associate professor at East Stroudsburg University. While earning his doctorate degree at Penn State University College of Medicine, he worked primarily on dissecting mechanisms by which viruses assemble during replication. His postdoctoral research at the University of Miami Sylvester Cancer Institute focused on the use of genetically engineered viruses as novel treatments for cancer. In 2005, he accepted a faculty position at Nova Southeastern University and remained there for 10 years. While at NSU, he frequently taught courses in microbiology, genetics, immunology, and cell biology. Additionally, he developed a new course on the history of epidemic disease and gave frequent invited lectures on the same subject. Dr. Loomis moved to East Stroudsburg University in 2015 and continued his teaching and research in microbiology. He has since become a partner in the Small World Initiative, which is a global consortium of scientists and students working together in search of novel antibiotics produced by soil microorganisms. Dr. Loomis has published his research in numerous scientific journals, including the Journal of Virology and Nature Immunology. In 2008, he published his first book entitled Epidemics: The Impact of Germs and Their Power Over Humanity. His work on the history of epidemic disease has been featured in the Los Angeles Times, The Hill, and The New Yorker. Thank you very much, Josh, for joining us tonight. It's great to have you here, and we're all looking forward to your presentation titled Epidemics, Lessons from the Past, and a Look to the Future. Certainly a very, very timely program for us.
All right, well, thank you very much, Amy, and for the Monroe County Historical Association for having me. Yeah, this is a topic that I've been interested in on and off for upwards of 20 years. And as Amy mentioned, it's a topic that is especially of interest to us now, unfortunately, in 2020, dealing with the COVID pandemic. And really gets to two questions: is how have these epidemics that our species has fought with over really the entire history of our existence, how have they impacted us? How have they shaped us as human beings? And how can we apply that knowledge, not only as we deal with COVID, but as we look to possibly future epidemics that, it's scary as it thought, that may even be worse than COVID. So that's what I'm going to try to hope to address tonight, and go beyond just death statistics, because if you're not in microbiology, that's probably what you typically know of epidemics. This one killed 50 million people, that one killed 2 million people, and you don't really hear the stories behind these diseases and how all those deaths impacted people. In case you're wondering, this first slide, the picture that you see was a typical site during the polio epidemic in 1940s and 1950s. And what you're looking at there is a series of kids that are in what we call the iron lung. It was one of the early forms of artificial respiration. And this was a common site. This was one from California, Downey, California in 1950. It was one of these images that was usually plastered when they were talking about polio. So let's get into the conversation. So before we get into the individual kind of impacts, I thought it was important to at least quickly define what is an epidemic. We hear this term thrown around in the news every day, and we hear other terms like pandemic and outbreak, and I just want to quickly clarify those. So almost by definition, epidemic is widespread. It's a widespread infectious disease. We use the term for obesity epidemic and gun violence epidemic, but for our purposes, it's a widespread infectious disease that has increased in frequency and impacts a population over a relatively large geographical area. So for instance, a disease that's affecting all of China or all of the United States, you would call that an epidemic. A disease affecting one small town in Australia, you would not call that an epidemic. It's not affecting enough people. So related to that are these other terms like outbreak. An outbreak would be a case where there's a small isolated cluster of infection. We saw this in some of the earlier Ebola outbreaks in Western Africa, where it would affect just a small town initially, and sometimes it would grow to a bigger epidemic. Or there's an outbreak of salmonella in Stroudsburg as a result of a certain restaurant. So again, that's more isolated. A pandemic's on sort of the opposite end of the spectrum, is worldwide. So what we're going through with COVID now is a perfect example of a pandemic. And you can see on the bottom right picture there is showing swine flu in 2009 as an example of a pandemic. Each dot is showing a focus of infection. So you see it pretty much was everywhere. 1918 flu was a typical pandemic. Another term that is often associated with epidemics is something called is endemic. Endemic is when a disease kind of always exists in a population. Probably the best example for most of us that are my age or older would be chicken pox. I mean, now we have a vaccine, so it's not really so much endemic anymore. But chicken pox was one of these things that just always existed. Everyone pretty much got it as a kid or early adulthood. And it never really went away. Smallpox in Europe for most of its history was endemic. It was basically just always there. The common cold is endemic. So we're going to talk about that in various situations where a disease may have been endemic in a certain situation. All right. So kind of, I think, a good overall question to start this presentation is, why do we care about past epidemics? Why did I teach a course in this? Why did I decide to write the book about epidemics? Because they really have a lot to teach us. Microbes have killed billions of human beings. We don't even know the true number, but people that have tried to estimate it put it 3 to 4 billion people throughout history that have been killed by epidemic disease. Every war up until the early 20th century, more people died of disease than they did of the actual battle wounds. So because they have killed so many of us, and because we were always really at their mercy throughout most of human history, they played a major role in shaping who human beings are. Our history, our culture, our religion, our lifestyle, and even to some extent our genome has been shaped by these diseases. So to really understand what it means to be human, you have to understand these epidemics, because the two are intimately linked. They have altered the course of human history. And I'm going to give you guys just a few examples of that. Obviously, just for the sake of time, there have been whole books and volumes of books written about single ones of these epidemics. 1918 flu, you can have a whole library of books written about 1918 flu. So obviously I can't give a comprehensive rundown of all the ways they've impacted human history, but they have. And another reason why to care about past epidemics, there is an application aspect to this. The more we understand about past epidemics, the more we're prepared to face current struggles and possibly future threats. And we've seen this, why I actually have these two pictures here on the slide. This whole idea of social distancing really came about as a result of the 1918 flu pandemic. Social distancing and wearing masks in public, mass quarantines where healthy people were quarantined to their homes. It didn't really exist at any great level before 1918 flu. And so when Corona broke out, we sort of knew what to do because of 1918 flu. The reason why we're making such good headway with vaccines now is we've built a history of 200 years worth of vaccine research that have led us to this moment. So they have a lot to teach us, which is why I really became interested in this topic initially. So let's kind of start with some of the lessons from past epidemics. I'm going to start with some of the more immediate impacts. So these would have been impacts that would have been experienced by those going through the epidemic, not things 100 years later. We could see this affected this, which affected this. I'm not talking 100-year later impact, but what would have affected those going through the disease at the time. One of the major impacts would have been a major disruption of normal social structures and social institutions at the time. And probably the best example of this, you can argue one of the most impactful epidemics in human history, and it's hard to really come up with one that was more impactful, was the Black Death that started really in any great level in 1347. It kind of was probably around in the 1330s, but it started killing people in mass in 1347. And there was a 4-year period where it wiped out much of Europe. There are estimates of 1/4 to 1/3 of all of Europe's population was destroyed by Black Death. People thought the world was ending. If you look at literature and art at the time, they really thought this was God's final judgment. It ended up lasting a total of about 400 years collectively. But in killing so many people so quickly in just a 4-year period, it absolutely destroyed governments at really every level. It killed people on all social levels, from peasants to kings. This painting is really interesting. It's Triumph of Death from 1562, where it shows, you can see the skeleton figures in there around all these different classes of people. You see there's a king, there's a cardinal, the peasants. It affected everyone, and affected everyone pretty equally. So it really disrupted social structures. People abandoned the Catholic Church, which was really the only Christian church at the time. People abandoned it in massive numbers because they thought God had abandoned them. And they saw priests and nuns dying at high rates. And so they basically said, what's the point? Family members abandoned one another. There were stories written of parents leaving their children to die alone, and husbands leaving wives, and children leaving parents. It really affected society all throughout Europe. And it really probably took about 100 years before European society recovered from it fully. And you can argue in some cases, like the church, for instance, you can trace the Protestant Reformation, just over 150 years after this point. You can trace that beginning because of the devastation that was levied by Black Death. There was also a major economic disruption, and I kind of chuckle. I've seen on Facebook and my friends and family saying, what we're experiencing with COVID-19 economically is unprecedented. And I'm trying to tell them it's nowhere near unprecedented. Every one of these epidemics had this and much worse economic impacts. Black Death, as I just mentioned, dead people don't work and dead people don't pay taxes. So it completely disrupted the economic system. Actually, the Black Death was at a time during feudal rule where you had the kings giving land to the lords who had knights, and then the servants, the serfs, worked the land. That Black Death completely disrupted that system, and basically the survivors were able to negotiate higher wages because there weren't that many of them left. And so we saw the rise of the middle class. We saw an early form of capitalism come about because of Black Death. If you look at the history of the Medici family of Florence, they rose to prominence as a result of the Black Death. HIV and malaria in Africa has had devastating impacts over the last 30, 40 years. We see a reduction of GDP in some Southern African countries by 1% to 2% every year. We've seen economic growth drop by 2% to 4%. These countries are so busy spending money on dealing with HIV and malaria that they're not using it for technological advancements. And you can argue that much of the poverty that sub-Saharan Africa faces is due to these ongoing epidemic diseases. Obviously, there are other issues there as well with sectarian violence and things, but it had significant impacts. Yellow fever had major impacts to the economy in the American South. There were major yellow fever epidemics along the Mississippi River in 1853 and 1878. So it hit right before the Civil War, which really weakened the ability of the Southern Army to really mount, much of a resistance against the North. The North obviously was more industrialized, but the South was impoverished in large part because of yellow fever and malaria to some extent. And then in 1878 was even a worse yellow fever epidemic. That Reconstruction had just ended in really 1877, and so the South was looking to really reboot their economy, and this just devastated them and put them behind a couple decades. Tuberculosis really devastated the slums and kept people poor during the Industrial Revolution, the middle of the 19th century. So economic disruption is a very common byproduct of epidemic disease. An unfortunate, not that those other impacts are great, but one that was really unfortunate for those that were living at the time. And we're seeing this to some extent now, not to this extent, but whenever you have a lot of people dying and people don't understand why, that fear and panic often leads to mobs forming, and then you get persecution and violence as a result. Scared people look for a cause. And up until really the middle of the 19th century, we had no idea what was causing these epidemics. The microbial revolution happened really in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, and then a bit later. Before that, they thought it was evil spirits, earthquakes, bad smells. They had no idea why people were dying, and so they would look for someone to blame. And some really famous examples of this, smallpox in year 166 that struck the Roman Empire. The Romans looked for someone to blame, and there was this new religion that had cropped up in the Roman Empire at that time. And so they started rounding up Christians en masse and slaughtered them because they felt the Christians were angering the Roman gods and with their disrespect. And so they thought if they killed them, that smallpox would go away. Even more famous case of this was during the Black Death, where Jews were rounded up all over Europe. There were some really big examples of this in Stroudsburg, France. 1349, this is what this picture is showing. There was a famous case where about 2,000 Jews were rounded up because they thought they were poisoning the wells, and that's what was causing Black Death. And they burned them at the stake. And this wasn't an uncommon thing. Jews were slaughtered all over Europe during the Black Death because of this. It all started, actually, there was one Jew who was arrested, who they tortured for days, eventually admitted under duress, obviously, that he had poisoned one of the wells in Venice. And so then news of that spread all over the place. And so they then started mass murder of the Jews. Cholera in the 1800s that struck Great Britain led to widespread violence. There actually were a group of riots at the time that were called cholera riots for a different reason than the previous ones I just went through. This was happening at a time when grave robbing was very common, that doctors would steal bodies from graves in order to dissect them to learn, they had these surgical schools. Leonardo da Vinci famously used to take bodies in the middle of the night. Well, they saw a lot of people, mainly the poor, dying of cholera. And so the poor started getting the idea that the doctors were doing this on purpose in order to make money. And so they started burning down hospitals and killing doctors. There were stories of doctors jumping out of the windows as they were setting fire to the hospital. It was pretty widespread. Some of these riots would last several weeks. And then there were later ones in Russia as a result of cholera as well. Anyone that's, again, my age or older, lived through HIV in the 1980s, where we saw widespread, not so much violence, but certainly persecution of anyone that's suspected of having HIV. We saw homosexuals and people from Haiti who were labeled early on as being carriers of HIV, and it was one of those things that wasn't true. Everyone that lived through this may remember the young man Ryan White, who became a spokesperson for those with HIV. He had contracted it from a blood transfusion. They made a made-for-TV movie at the time. His house was firebombed during all this. He was barred from going to school. It was a really violent time, and it's hard to imagine. Think about the Black Death from 1347, and it was basically happening again in 1987. That showed that humankind hadn't really changed as much as we like to think. Scared mobs still become violent, even to this day. Something that we've all experienced, maybe more than even other previous epidemics, is social isolation. That was common. Quarantines began in the 14th century. Black Death was actually the first use of a quarantine in human history. If you look at the Latin root of it, it means 40 days, basically, that they would make ships stay in port for 40 days before allowing them to disembark, because they didn't want Black Death to spread to the city. So they realized it sort of worked, and so quarantines were common. Now, quarantining the healthy is more of a modern kind of development. We saw that really in mass with the 1918 flu, but also the polio epidemic. I'm too young to have experienced that myself, but I asked my mom, and she remembers summers being kept inside because parents were afraid that their kids would get polio from swimming pools or swimming in the creek, just being around other children. So, again, that's not uncommon, the social isolation to give rise. And polio is even worse, that if you got polio, there were stories of kids being in those iron lungs that I showed you for 6 months to a year, basically by themselves. It was a really kind of horrific situation for them. And I'll give you a quick little fun tidbit, if there is a fun tidbit about epidemic disease. The game Candyland was invented by a woman. She was an adult who contracted polio and was stuck with a bunch of kids in these polio wards, and she felt bad for them, so she invented a game to keep them company. And if you look at the really early version of the game, the little characters you would move around the board were in wheelchairs or had leg braces. And then obviously when the big companies, Milton Bradley, I think, bought it, they didn't want their characters to be, having disabilities, so they changed it. But yeah, polio epidemic gave rise to Candyland because of that social isolation. Epidemics have restricted movement of people between cities. Again, we've seen this now. People in the U.S. are barred from going to most countries in the world right now because of this. We saw this going all the way back to the 19th century, when you had rail travel. Cholera was a big issue at religious festivals. When Hindu festivals at the Ganges, cholera, the bacterium, it's Vibrio cholera, grows really well in the Ganges. And so they would go to these festivals. You'd have, some cases, millions of people going in the water, and sometimes they would even bring water back to their home because the Ganges was seen as being holy. They would see massive spreading of cholera all throughout Asia, and then it would spread to Europe, because Great Britain obviously was in control of India at the time. And then it would make its way to the United States eventually. So they tried to restrict these festivals and those to the Hajj, the Muslim go to Mecca and Medina. They saw these as hotspots of disease spread. And when they tried to restrict it, it often led to some cases of violence, because people were doing this out of a religious obligation. We saw restriction of immigrant movement as a result primarily of typhus and yellow fever. Typhus was a disease of, as we'll talk about in a little bit, is a disease of armies, but also a disease of the poor. It's spread by body lice. And so any group of people that are put into a small environment and they don't have an ability to wash their clothes and their linens spread typhus like crazy. And so we saw typhus and yellow fever spreading from different places to the United States and from country to country. So it was one of the first times they put restrictions on immigrant movement. And so they created these quarantine hospitals. We all know the famous one, Ellis Island in New York City, but it wasn't the first. Actually, we were closer to the first one. It was called Lazaretto in Philadelphia in 1799. And then Angel Island in California came about. These were basically the conduit between people coming in and you releasing them into your population. And if people came to these places and were diseased, they often would send them back. They wouldn't let them in because they didn't want diseases coming to their population. And it's unfortunate that a lot of immigrants were always seen as being diseased because of this. Famously, the Irish potato famine that happened in the 1800s, you had immigrants from Ireland coming to the Americas that were riddled with typhus, and their ships, they actually called them coffin ships, because there are some cases that 50% of the people on board would die of typhus on the way over, and they often would, it's awful, they would throw them overboard, and so you'd see like sharks following the ships. It was really an awful situation, and so you can imagine when these ships would arrive to Quebec or to New York City or Philadelphia or Boston, they didn't want them to disembark because they were afraid of typhus and these other diseases. So that's an example. And then HIV, again, gave travel restrictions to people from Haiti. People from Haiti were not allowed to come in the United States for some time because they thought that they were carrying HIV. So now we're going to switch some more of kind of the immediate impacts to how bigger picture human history was impacted by these epidemics. And one of the big ones, and again, there's not time, I wish there was, to go through the bulk of these stories, but I'll give you just kind of a flavor of some of them. The Roman Empire was majorly impacted by several different epidemics. I don't want to say epidemics unilaterally caused the fall of the Roman Empire. You study the Roman Empire, you know they were messed up in other ways. They weren't producing food well enough. They were too spread out, and their armies became weak. But the Antonine Plague, which was smallpox in the year 100, led to a loss of the western half of the Roman Empire. They basically killed so many people that they weren't able to fund their army. And so the Germanic tribes started moving in very soon after this, the Goths and the Vandals, and eventually overtook the western half. The eastern half, which was centered in Constantinople, maintained control for some years until the Mongols came in later. The Justinian Plague, which was caused by bubonic plague, hit in 541. That came at a time when actually the eastern half of the Roman Empire was considering trying to reunify. They had moved more west and were on the cusp of recreating the original Roman Empire, going all the way through Western Europe, and bubonic plague hit, and it wiped out Justinian I's army, and that basically put a kibosh on those plans. So the Roman Empire never did reunify, in part possibly due to bubonic plague. Probably the most famous example of empires being decimated by epidemic disease are the empires of the Americas, and you don't necessarily call them an empire, but the Aborigines of Australia were also wiped out, the native peoples. It wasn't just one disease. Smallpox killed the most, but it also was measles and flu. And there's estimates about 90% of Aztec, Inca, and Mayan, and then the other smaller tribes, and actually some of them were pretty big in the North America, were just wiped out by epidemic disease. We like to give credit to the European powers from Spain and Portugal, people like Cortez and Pizarro. You know, history proclaims them to be these great warriors that conquered these massive empires, when in reality, they sent in the diseases first. Cortez was carrying a slave on his ship that had smallpox that ended up entering you know, the Aztec Empire, and after a few months, everyone was either sick or dead. So then Cortez really had no problem overtaking it at that point. The famous stories that I think most people know of the US military giving blankets that were riddled with smallpox to native tribes. And there's good evidence they actually did. There are correspondence. Lord Amherst, famously of Amherst College, brought up the suggestion at Fort Pitt, and one of his cronies wrote back saying, "Hey, that's a great idea. I think I'll try it." And a smallpox epidemic broke out very soon after that amongst the natives there. So it had devastating impacts on those empires. It also impacted a lot of conflicts, battles, and wars. And there's a lot of, what if here in these situations. The English Civil War and the 30 Years' War, which was horrific in the 1600s, was majorly impacted by typhus. I told you typhus was a disease of armies. There were some battles that got canceled, that everyone on both sides was sick, and they said, let's wait. And there were other examples where one side got sick, and so the other side ended up winning, in large part because 2/3 of their fighting force was sick or dead with typhus. Most of the wars between the Protestants and the Catholics and the Muslims, for the better part of 200 years, a lot of those battles were decided by typhus breaking out on one side rather than the other. A real cool story that, again, is kind of related to something close to us here was the American Revolution was in large part impacted by smallpox. Europeans, the British, were pretty much all immune to smallpox because, as I told you, it was endemic in Europe. You got smallpox as a kid when you grew up in Great Britain. And so when those soldiers came over, they were all protected. Well, if you were born in the Americas, the Continental Army, they had not experienced smallpox before. So Washington and Jefferson and Adams, they were deathly afraid that smallpox was going to break out amongst the Continental Army and wipe it out. And it actually happened to some extent in the north, in Quebec, which one of the reasons why the British won up there is because smallpox did break out in the Continental Army, and they were too sick to fight. So Washington said, hey, we can't deal with this. And there actually were stories of the British sending in spies that had smallpox to try to start an epidemic in the army. So Washington said, we got to deal with this. So during the winters of 1777, 1778 at Valley Forge near Philly, he decided to inoculate his entire army against smallpox. Now, the vaccine wasn't available then. The vaccine was developed in 1798. But there was a rudimentary form of it called variolation, where you would take basically material from a scab of someone that had smallpox and inoculate it into their hand or their arm. You can see the little lesion there in the picture on the bottom right. And they would be sick for sometimes several weeks, high fever, muscle ache, kind of the worst flu-like symptoms you've ever experienced. And he did this for his entire army, essentially. He basically made a mandate that if you didn't do this, you would be kicked out. And he actually had men beaten that lied about being variolated, that he later found out they hadn't. Well, it turns out it worked, and long story short, we're not all speaking with a British accent right now as a result of this. We don't know what would have happened, but if you used what happened in Quebec as a model, it's very likely that smallpox could have changed the history of the United States forever. So I thought, again, that was kind of a cool story. Now, other conflicts, just I want to mention a couple of them here. Napoleon was drastically impacted by several epidemic diseases, and I'll give you kind of the Cliff Notes version of this. In 1802, he had sent a significant force, tens of thousands of troops, to Haiti to retake control of it. Haiti had a slave revolt that actually resulted in its independence. It was the only slave revolt in human history at the time that had led to an actual independent country. So Haiti had won control from the French. Napoleon said, nope, I want it back. So he sent the troops over, and they actually have correspondence that show that Napoleon's plan was to take back Haiti and then invade New Orleans and make his way over to the United States and take over the United States. Well, yellow fever broke out in Haiti during this time it was actually late 1700s, early 1800s, and wiped out his force. It killed like 2/3 of the French troops. So Napoleon said, okay, I've had it enough. I'm not dealing with the Americas anymore. And he ended up making a deal with Thomas Jefferson shortly after that for the Louisiana Purchase. So it basically doubled the size of the United States. And again, we don't know what would happen. What if Napoleon was successful? Again, we may all been speaking with French accents at this point. But yellow fever clearly impacted his plans for the Americas. An even worse case of epidemic disease thwarting Napoleon, he invaded Russia in 1812, again made famous by War and Peace, the novel. Well, he had about 600,000 troops, invaded Russia, crossed through Poland. Well, unfortunately for Napoleon, he was headstrong and he didn't listen to his health minister, who told him, A, we need to slow down, and B, we need to make sure our men do not go into Poland and fraternize with the locals. Well, there was a typhus outbreak occurring in Poland at the time, and a number of his troops brought it back to the army. And as they made their way through Russia to Moscow, his fighting force gradually whittled down. They estimate about 200,000 to 300,000 of his troops died of typhus before even arriving at Moscow. So if you read the history of Napoleon's invasion of Russia, you always hear about the starvation, you hear about the winter, which was brutal, and you hear about the Russian army, which is fierce, and all that is true. But very rarely do you hear that typhus killed almost half of the troops before any of that even happened. And so Napoleon, the number of troops that made it safely back to Paris after this was in the low thousands. There was only less than 5,000 troops. So typhus and yellow fever really defeated Napoleon more than foreign armies did. And I won't get into these stories, but malaria canceled battles during World War I. I'll give you just a little tidbit of it. The Germans were actually poised to win World War I. They had really taken control in the East and decided to move west and start battling there. Well, malaria broke out in the Balkans during this time, and the German army said, if we move too fast, we will all die of malaria, so let's just sit tight for the next few months. Well, in those next few months, the United States joined the war, and obviously massive influx of money and troops to the Western Front, and that changed the tide of the war at that point. So again, we don't know if Germans decided, if malaria wasn't there and they decided to move west earlier, what would have happened. But it's possible that could have impacted history. And the Civil War was impacted by the mosquito-borne diseases of malaria and yellow fever. A really cool byproduct, if again, we talk about death and destruction a lot with epidemics, but a cool byproduct of epidemic disease was major changes to the practice of medicine. People realized that if we don't innovate, we could die out as a species. So we saw the creation of medicine as we know it because of these epidemics. Before Black Death, for instance, it was easy to become a doctor. You apprenticed for a few months and boom, you were a doctor. When they realized that didn't work during the Black Death, we see the first medical schools. We see the first cases of dissection, textbooks. There were certifications required. That came about because of Black Death. Number of technologies, too many to really get into right now, but intravenous fluids were basically invented because of cholera. The stethoscope and chest x-rays were invented because they needed a way of diagnosing tuberculosis. And so they invented a tube to listen to people's chests to see if they had bacteria in their lungs. ICUs and artificial respiration and physical therapy all came about because of polio. Think about the round-the-clock care that someone with polio had. They couldn't breathe on their own, so they required 24-hour care. Well, that didn't exist, and so they had to develop an ICU as a result to care for that, and then they basically now are in every hospital in the world. Vaccines and antibiotics, they came about to fight off epidemic disease. Penicillin didn't work against tuberculosis. The first 5 to 10 antibiotics didn't work against tuberculosis. So people kept looking, and it created an antibiotic revolution because they wanted to find a cure for tuberculosis, which they eventually did in the mid-1950s with the discovery of streptomycin, right close to here in Rutgers. It also changed city design. Epidemic disease, primarily cholera and typhoid, the waterborne diseases, people were sick all the time because they were constantly drinking contaminated water. And this came about mainly in the 1850s. So they had the sanitation revolution. They realized, hey, there are bacteria in this water, and that's what's making us sick. So they decided to develop sewers and landfills and water treatment. Before this, they used to dump the waste in local streams and rivers and then get their drinking water from the same place. In the summertime, the Thames and these other water sources would become so smelly, people would flee the city. So they decided, hey, we need to clean this up. It's funny, there were some cities like in London where people realized this occurred, and so they would just drink beer for breakfast, lunch, and dinner because they knew if they drank the water, they would get sick. There was a cool documentary done, How Beer Saved Mankind. It was done a few years ago. I highly recommend it. They also realized that slums were a hotbed of tuberculosis. We had sometimes 30, 40 people sharing one room. And when they realized that was the case, they just said, hey, we gotta change these slums and let people spread out a little bit. We need to put ventilation in our factories because in the height of tuberculosis epidemic during the Industrial Revolution, like a third of all people in Europe were dying of TB. They built parks and green spaces. If you look at Central Park and other major cities, you could see they are largely built in the middle of the 1800s when they were redesigning these cities because of epidemic disease. For those that, again, were alive during the HIV epidemic, we know that it had major changes in our attitudes about sexuality and sex. You know, we had the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, you know, this free love movement, which was helped by a birth control pill and it was helped by antibiotics, which you could use to treat most of the STDs. Well, HIV ended that. In 1981, it became clear that sex could kill you. And so this fear of sex really hit the population. It's the first time we started seeing widespread advertising for condom usage and safe sex. We started seeing billboards of this and magazines. That didn't exist before HIV at the level. I mean, health classes were taught how to put condoms on. Again, that all really changed because of HIV. And that safe sex movement did have impacts on pregnancy rates. We saw pregnancy rates go down as a result of HIV, and the rates of STD transmission go down. Chlamydia and herpes and HPV, they all dropped because people were having safer sex because of HIV, and it had this kind of downstream effect. A kind of quick, cool story. We saw the rise of medical philanthropy as a result of epidemic disease. This came about in the 1940s with FDR. FDR is believed to have had polio. Most people think it was polio. There are some that think it might have been another disease, but he used to travel to Georgia and go to a warm springs there, and he started having these big fundraising events where he would invite all his wealthy friends and they would raise money for this health springs in Georgia. Well, they realized that wasn't raising enough money. So he got his buddy, Eddie Cantor, who was a radio personality at the time, to go on the radio and ask the population for donations and basically said, hey, anything you can spare, send money to the White House, to FDR, to let's fight polio. Let's raise money to find a vaccine for polio. Send anything you have, even send a dime if that's all you can afford. Well, within a week, they were getting on average like 50,000 letters, all containing dimes. There's an awesome picture of FDR secretary with stacks of letters in her office, all filled with dimes. And they created a charity from that called the March of Dimes. Well, long story short, it worked. The money raised from the March of Dimes ended up funding the Salk polio vaccine and the Sabin polio vaccine. And it funded 8 other Nobel laureates and countless other vaccines. So it created a template. Say, hey, we can crowdsource fundraising to fight diseases. And before long, you had the American Heart Association, Cancer Society. We all remember the Jerry Lewis telethons for muscular dystrophy. This didn't exist before polio. March of Dimes created the movement, and we saw, you know, billions of dollars and numerous treatments and cures for diseases that came about because of this. And really now at kind of the basic level here, the epidemic disease, as I alluded to before, altered the human genome. We've known this for a while, that certain genetic mutations protect us from infectious disease. Probably the most famous one is sickle cell anemia. If you have that, you're protected against malaria. So the idea is that if you had that mutation during an epidemic, you were likely to survive. You were likely to have children who survived, who had children who had children. Before long, you had whole populations that had these mutations. If you go to sub-Saharan Africa, almost the entire population of sub-Saharan Africa has some mutation in the red blood cells that provide protection against malaria. And we saw there's a mutation that provides protection against Black Death. There's a mutation that likely provides protection against cholera. So these epidemic diseases literally altered the human genome permanently in large portions of the population. It's really weird to think about that. That's how intimately we're associated with these things. It changed who we are on the genetic level, which I've always found really to be amazing. So now in the last couple of slides here, let's transition. So that was all the lessons from past epidemics and what we've seen, how they've impacted us. How can we apply that now to COVID? Well, I think the biggest lesson that people have asked me during this whole time, I tell them the biggest lesson from our past epidemics is that they can be defeated. I'll read through polio, smallpox, measles, plague, typhus, typhoid, cholera, yellow fever. We've controlled all of those, either with antibiotics, vaccines, or some other kind of control mechanism. We can do it. And the smallpox eradication is the greatest example of that. We eliminated smallpox from the human population in 1977. That was the last case of smallpox on Earth. And what was amazing about it, it involved the United States and the Soviet Union. I mean, think we were trying to nuke each other at that time. And the two governments worked together. They shared their money, they shared their scientists, and said, we have a common enemy. So it showed that if you invest the money, if you put health above politics, if you get public support, it can be done. But the public has to trust medical science, and we have to be willing to learn from our past failures. I think the smallpox eradication is one of the greatest achievements in human history, honestly. Smallpox killed over 1 billion people for thousands of years, and we stopped it. We eliminated it. I just find that absolutely amazing. We also I've talked about good can come from disaster. We are better prepared now to fight future epidemics because of what we learned from past ones. We've had these technological innovations. We've created vaccines and antibiotics, sanitation. We're stronger now because of these past epidemics. And it's too early to know how COVID may make us stronger, but hopefully it will. Maybe it will change how we do business. We've seen this with doing virtual business. We're educating our children differently now, maybe not for the better, but even at the college level, we're worshiping different now. We don't know how many of these things are going to last 50 years from now, but there will be impacts that if someone giving this talk 50 years from now, they will point to certain things that hopefully was changed for the better. Because the next slide is some of the bad things we've seen from COVID, lessons we learned from COVID, and that is we're always one pandemic away from global disaster. Think about your life in January of this year and think about in April. We were all huddled, isolated in our homes, and this disease destroyed the economy in 1 month, the world economy in 1 month. Technology has lessened them, the frequency and the impacts, but we're not free from disease as we once thought. We thought we had conquered epidemic diseases with all this technology. This has shown that we have not. We're all one disease away from, and COVID isn't as bad as it could be. I know it's awful, but imagine that the fatality rate was 30%. It's bad enough. I mean, we have over 700,000 deaths worldwide. What if the fatality was 30% on this thing? We'd be looking at 30, 40 million deaths at this point. We also have learned that politicizing the epidemic is dangerous. When you're making wearing a mask a political statement, that's problematic. It leads to misinformation being spread. It leads to rejection of life-saving measures. It prolongs the epidemic in that case. And this little picture here was an anti-mask meeting notice from 1918 to show you, hey, we haven't progressed too much in 102 years. Even with all of our information, we still are rejecting these vital tools that we have. So politicizing is dangerous, and downplaying the severity is very dangerous. It's on its way out. It's not that bad. It's better to always err on the side of being safe. Downplaying it slows the response speed and efficacy. So we've largely worldwide not done as well as we could have with COVID. I'm hoping that will change, and as the vaccine becomes available. But with that, I'll stop and take any questions you may have. Thank you, guys. I'll stop my share screen now.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can, yep.
Was wonderful. I loved everything about it.
Yeah, it's a kind of depressing topic, right in the book.
No, but it was very, very interesting, and we definitely have some questions that have come in. I'm just going to kind of, they're not, obviously not in any kind of order. You know, with COVID, there's so many, seems to be so many different symptoms of it, and people experience different things. How is it with other endemics or pandemics? Did the Plague, did everybody have the same symptom? You know,
Great
what
question.
makes COVID so different?
COVID is, I would say it's on the end of the spectrum where it is highly variable. Bubonic plague was very clear. Yellow fever was very clear. Cholera, most of the disease I talked about, there was no denying you had cholera. There was no denying yellow fever. 1918 flu was a little weird that it gave weird symptoms that they weren't used to. But most of the disease, that's a great question. Most of the disease actually that I went through, maybe typhus was one because it caused a fever, and a lot of things cause fevers. But COVID is unique in that regard. That presents loss of smell and taste and flu-like symptoms, heart, cardiomyopathy. It really, it's hard to pinpoint. Now, there are other diseases. AIDS is a good example. It's a syndrome. There are people that get Kaposi sarcoma. There are people that have chronic wasting. AIDS is probably, I guess, the most similar to COVID in that regard, where there's a whole range of symptoms you can get, and there's no one unifying symptom. But basically, the other 9 to 10 other diseases I mentioned throughout this, they were all pretty straightforward, symptom-wise.
Right. Right. Here's a question. There was quite a bit in the news and online last week about the effect, if any, that the Spanish flu had on World War I. Any insight?
Yeah, so it kind of hit near the tail end of World War I. There's been a lot of debate about it. And from my research, I don't think it had a significant impact on World War I. I think, as I mentioned, malaria had a bigger impact. It really didn't start killing a lot of people. Remember, World War I ended in November of 18. 1918 flu peaked in about October of 18. The war was pretty well decided by then. It did have a major impact, along with typhus, on the Russian Revolution and the communist, the Russian Civil War and the Communist Revolution. There was a famous quote by Lenin that said, either typhus is going to defeat communism or communism is going to defeat typhus. Yeah, 1918 flu, people just kind of saw it as an extension of the war. It didn't affect any battles, and it sickened everyone pretty equally. So you can't really trace it saying, okay, it was decided by that disease in any measurable amount.
Okay. How do some diseases come back? You know, for example, like maybe some parents don't vaccinate and then there's measles or whooping cough. How does that happen when?
Yeah, so it shows those diseases are always endemic. So whooping cough and measles, great examples. They were eradicated from the United States, but from not from around the world. So as we stopped vaccinating at the levels we should be, as people were traveling, there's so much international travel now, all you need is one person to go to Disney World from any other country, and their kid has whooping cough. And now, there are great examples of church groups where they weren't vaccinating against measles, and basically you had this measles outbreak occur in that church group. So that's one way you get a reemergence of diseases, is you're not using the tools that we have to prevent them. Another way is simply, like I saw there was a case of bubonic plague in California last week. Bubonic plague, some diseases just never really go away. Bubonic plague still exists in large portions of India because they do have, in some places, a rat problem, and a plague is spread by some extent by the fleas. So sometimes they can be found in other animal hosts, or they're in some cases just in the soil. For instance, tetanus and botulism. I could get any cup of soil in Pennsylvania and isolate botulism from it. It's not that hard. I'm not going to tell you how to do that.
Please, no.
Some diseases are just around, and you're never going to get rid of them. The ones, though, that are only in humans, we can get rid of. Polio is a good example. Smallpox, as we did. There's no reason why we should still be getting sick from it. And it's sad that we're not using the tools we have, like vaccines, to battle them.
Right. Okay. Next question. My grandmother survived the 1918 flu, but it took her father and brother. Does her immunity give me any protection from COVID?
It wouldn't. In saying that, they have found that this weird thing with COVID, it's another kind of unique situation where you can be vaccinated against other stuff and it provides some level of protection against COVID. They found that people that get the flu vaccine every year, even though they're totally different viruses, they're not at all alike, the fact that you're getting vaccinated and you're freaking out your immune system, it helps then fight other things. So they're seeing this kind of bystander effect. And going back to the 1918 flu grandmother, if when your grandmother had your parent, either your mom or dad, she would have passed antibodies onto your parents, and so they, or one of your parents, would have been protected against 1918 flu had it reemerged. But those antibodies get lost after really a few months, and so yeah, unfortunately, there's no protection, and we haven't found any genetic mutations that could have been passed down for flu. It's not an old enough disease to have impacted the human genome like I talked about with malaria and plague.
Okay. Is climate change a factor in human exposure to COVID disease?
I mean, possibly. It certainly plays an impact with epidemic disease as a whole. We're seeing, think about rise in global temperatures, you're getting more rainfall. And with more rainfall, you're getting more mosquitoes. More mosquitoes, you're getting increases in malaria and yellow fever and Zika. We're seeing emergence of diseases as a result of not only the change in temperature, but the change in rainfall. You get famines that can move animals that are carrying diseases. Us, not just only climate change, but us chopping down rainforests can get, think about Ebola. It keeps entering the human population because we keep going into where these fruit bats happen to be near other primates. And so when we start killing these primates and get near these fruit bats, as a result, we now see these diseases entering the human population. There was a great book, geez, I don't remember when it was, I think it was early mid-90s, called The Coming Plague by Laurie Garrett. I read in high school, actually, I think led me to become a microbiologist, where she discussed that very thing. Us moving into nature in a bad way is leading to these diseases coming to us, and certainly global climate change is impacting it. I don't know if it had, coronaviruses are common, so I don't think, the coronavirus we have now is a mutant of SARS, which came about, about almost 10 years ago now. And that wasn't, I don't think, impacted as much by global climate change per se. It's us doing stupid things with fruit bats, definitely is what caused it. Yeah, great question.
Did the Spanish flu really develop in Kansas rather than Spain?
It did, yeah. A good thing to do when you are suffering from an epidemic disease is to name it after your enemy. So that was very common. You used to name diseases after the French or whatever, just to stick it to them. Spanish flu is named the Spanish flu because Spain was really the only country at the time that was reporting it in their newspapers. Most countries around the world was busy reporting about World War I. Spanish, the flu was always on, page 50 of the newspaper. Spain had it in front page. So it made people think that it arose in Spain, and then people thought it arose in China because a lot of flu strains arise in China. Turns out they traced it to a camp where they were training troops in Kansas, and then when they went to Europe, it just exploded. So we should have called it the American flu, not the Spanish flu, because it really did start with us. Nothing to do with Spain whatsoever. They didn't suffer from any worse than, actually they were somewhat better because they educated their population pretty early on because of the press. And so they actually had less flu than all the countries around them, and ironically.
If epidemics have unintentionally influenced outcomes of major conflicts throughout history, are there any instances when germs have intentionally been weaponized?
Great question. Yeah, not well. There were actually Black Death. There were people, first development of a catapult. It was actually the first biowarfare example in human history. They used catapults and flung dead bodies into cities that were being bombarded, and it worked. They did that in Kaffa, a city near Ukraine, and bubonic plague, Black Death, broke out in the city. And then there were other cases where they would take the Spanish tried to poison the wine, the French with, I think, syphilis, and it didn't work. The Japanese really were the ones that brought it to the greatest level during World War II. There was a famous camp in Manchuria where they were doing biowarfare tests, and they had plans to release plague-infected fleas over San Francisco. They actually developed weather balloons that would transport these fleas across the ocean and then rain down plague fleas into San Francisco. They did release anthrax and glanders into China. It's believed to have killed tens of thousands of people. And you actually can still meet some of the elderly that have diseases. Glanders would affect the lower leg. And I saw a documentary pretty recently where there are still survivors of it that were still influenced by it. So the Japanese were really, the Germans never really did it effectively. The Japanese perfected it, and mainly with the Chinese. They killed tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands. They released anthrax in cities. It was really pretty awful. Other than that, it really didn't work well because they didn't understand how that was transmitted. How are you going to give malaria to a population when you don't know that it was mosquitoes bringing it? So it really wasn't until the 1800s when we understood how diseases were transmitted properly. By then, they had other ways to kill people more effectively.
Right, and that was something that someone else had mentioned, that there's so many modes of transmission. You had mentioned lice, mosquitoes.
Absolutely.
There's and obviously COVID is supposed to be much,
Yeah, and that was early on COVID. I got a lot of emails and texts. Did the Chinese create this on purpose as a biowarfare agent? They did not. There's no evidence that it was designed. And honestly, as I told them, if I was designing a biowarfare agent, I wouldn't pick a coronavirus. Obviously it's done a lot of damage, but coronaviruses aren't especially clever or unique. They usually cause a common cold. They're not that great of a virus. I would pick ones that are a lot more dangerous, that are a lot more stable, that have a higher fatality rate. So it wouldn't have been very intelligent if that's what they used. So it just didn't make sense. And genetically, there's no evidence that it's a natural mutant of the SARS virus. They call it SARS-2. They can trace the actual mutations from it. So it was not designed in a Chinese lab in Wuhan, like people are saying. It's one of these conspiracy theories. Again, it's being politicized. There's no scientific evidence that it was designed.
Right, that really was our next question. Many people believe that many of these viruses were created in the lab, and then what is your belief? So thank you for going ahead.
There's really been no good example of a genetically engineered agent that has successfully entered the human population. I was hearing that with HIV for a lot of years, that the government created to kill the communists, to kill homosexuals, to kill African Americans. And scientific community disproved that. HIV came from a primate virus called SIV. They actually found the missing link. They found a virus that sort of looked like SIV and sort of looked like HIV from the 1920s. They dug up a body and found this virus. So it couldn't have been engineered by the government in the 1920s. The technology didn't exist. So it just shows there's always these conspiracy theories. Going back to the Black Death, when we can't understand what's happening, our first thought, someone must be doing this on purpose. No, it was random. It was just a random mutation that took place. And as scary as that sounds, because like, oh crap, what other mutations are out there that's going to get us? It makes us feel better to say that someone created it, but no, it was a random mutation. Yeah, great question.
Okay, do you know what percentage medical professionals believe that the COVID-19 vaccine may have negative effects on recipients?
Yeah, that's a great question that it's probably the one I'm least able to answer because there are so many vaccines come down the pike, and they're all different from one another. There's one's an RNA vaccine, one that's attenuated. It really depends on whatever vaccine wins the race. For certain vaccines, there will be no risk whatsoever to the human population. If they do use an RNA-based vaccine, it is impossible for that vaccine to harm us, unless, obviously, again, you think that they're microchipping it or something crazy like that. the vaccine itself will be safe. Now, a live attenuated vaccine, like the measles vaccine, because it is a live virus, it potentially could cause harm. But the ones that are now in phase 3 aren't live attenuated vaccines. So it may not work. I think the worst case scenario is they mass distribute this thing and they find that it's only 30% effective. So people will say, oh, I got vaccinated, I'm safe. I can go to a party now, when in fact that they're only 30% protected. That to me is the bigger risk, not that the vaccine itself is going to make you sick. It will go through enough safety testing. And again, these vaccines now are not like smallpox vaccine of 1798. They are well designed to be safe. Now, again, yes, the live vaccines can be dangerous, but these RNA-based ones aren't. They're pretty safe as far as vaccines go.
From your research, how do you grade Pennsylvania's response to the coronavirus, especially when weighing the huge economic crisis?
I think it's done one of the best jobs I've seen. And a lot of that is the population, a lot of that is the governor. We took it seriously. We didn't too quickly open up like we've seen now. I'm from Florida, and we've seen what's happened, especially in South Florida. They opened everything up, people were crowding the beaches, and now they've had explosions. Pennsylvania took a much more measured response, go from green to yellow, or from red to yellow, yellow to green, and then all the phases. Done a great job. And if you look at the case number and the rates of death, it's pretty much been leveled. It's leveled off. And then there's little hot spots that will emerge in cities like Philly and Pittsburgh. But for the size of our population, we have a pretty big population compared to a lot of other states. And our case number is much less. You can get tested, I think, pretty easily. As you know, Amy, I thought I had COVID 2 weeks ago, and I got tested for free and I got my result the next day. Pennsylvania has done a pretty good job of responding to it.
Okay, AIDS required direct contact, yet COVID does seem to require direct connect. Therefore, it is truly airborne.
Yeah, so it's a good point. I think I know where they're getting with. When you say something is airborne, there's actually two things you could be talking about. One is you're standing 2 feet in front of me, I cough or breathe, and then you inhale it. Technically, the virus was in the air, obviously. You contracted it from there. But epidemiologists, when they say an airborne pathogen, that means I could cough in a room, and 2 hours later, you can come in, and it's still floating around in the room. And most pathogens that are respiratory are not truly airborne. Tuberculosis is actually an exception. TB, it could be 24 hours later, and you could be breathing in the bacteria from someone that was in the room 24 hours earlier. There have been some recent studies that suggest COVID may be airborne. I personally don't think it's contracted effectively that way. Just because something theoretically could stay in the air a little bit doesn't mean if 98% of the virions have fallen to the ground, because that's what happens, the humidity in the air, the virus is floating in your little micro droplets, and the humidity of the air basically suffocates it, and then it falls to the ground from gravity. The few that happen to stay floating, I don't think is going to be enough of an exposure to make you sick. Yes, they have found it in the air after a few hours, after someone had been in the room, but it doesn't mean that is actually how it's being transmitted. So there's a big difference between it theoretically can be transmitted that way, and we've proven that it's transmitted that way. Same thing, I don't think you can get COVID from your groceries. Nothing against, I was disinfecting my groceries as well, but it probably was overkill. There was no scientific evidence that there was enough virus on your bread that you can then get it in your lungs. And again, it's a kind of a theoretical type of thing. The virus doesn't survive that well on objects. But again, so always be safe, clean your hands, clean everything. Don't quote me there saying, oh, you don't have to clean anything. I have bottles of alcohol all over my house, so.
What is your opinion on the saliva test?
Yeah, based on what I've read, it seems like it'll work. There's no reason why it shouldn't. It's all, I mean, basically the upper respiratory tract. The virus is in the saliva. The key is the sensitivity. That's where some of the issues were in the early COVID tests, that they weren't sensitive enough. You get a negative result even though you were positive. You get that false negative. And I think we've developed technology in the last 6 months, genetic technology, and I won't get into genetics there of using, it's called RT-PCR, where we can detect a handful of virus in a sample now. And the saliva test is using that really sensitive technology. So I'm hoping, because for me, false negatives are way worse than false positive. If someone tells me I'm positive, well, then I'm just going to quarantine and I may go to the hospital or not. If someone tells me I'm negative, but really I have the virus, I'm going to go on living my life and possibly spreading it to other people. So that's the most dangerous situation. You have to have a test that's going to pick up on the virus. And the ones we have are decent. There's always going to be some false negatives. They don't swab properly, or you just got infected and there's not enough virus in your lungs yet to detect. But from what I've seen, the saliva test seems like it'll work, hopefully. And it's quicker. It's a lot faster than some.
Right. Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
In the worst case, and a vaccine is not effective, how long do you see it taking for herd immunity, and will that work?
So there's others who may not agree with me. I want to preface with this. I don't think we'll ever get herd immunity against COVID. And the reason why I say that is because there are 4 other coronaviruses that have been in our population for 50 years. Now we hear about SARS and MERS and these really awful coronaviruses, but coronaviruses are endemic. There's 4 of them that are endemic in the human population that people get every single year. So if we use those as a model, there's no reason to believe that we're all going to get herd immunity. They estimate you need like 80–90% of the population to have been exposed to it. I don't know if we're ever going to achieve that. So people have asked me, what if we don't get a vaccine? And I said, get ready to be dealing with this possibly forever. Now, eventually, everyone will get it at some point, but I think new people will be born. And then there'll be a new host for the virus, and then more people are born. It will become like chickenpox was, and like the other 4 coronaviruses are currently. Saying that, we have a lot of money going into these vaccines. I'm pretty confident that we will get a vaccine. Coronaviruses, again, are not that clever. They're not like HIV, where we thought we'd have a vaccine by 1982. There were the quotes, oh, we're going to defeat this in a couple of years, and here we are 40 years later, still no HIV vaccine. HIV is a very, very clever virus. Coronaviruses are boring in that regard, genetically speaking. I think we'll be able to get a vaccine. There's a lot of very smart people working on this.
It kind of makes me think, the Black Death, you said it was 1347 to 1351, but there still are pockets of the plague that...
Absolutely, yeah. We're still technically, we are technically in a bubonic plague epidemic right now. Again, mostly in India and third world. But we've known about that disease for almost 700 years, and we still haven't quite gotten rid of it. Smallpox is the only serious human disease we've ever eradicated. Polio, I think a couple of years ago, we were down to only about 8 cases in the world. Polio is going to be the next one. I hope in my lifetime we'll see polio will disappear. But think about that. We've controlled them very well, but we haven't fully gotten rid of many diseases.
Right. But I'm just thinking the Black Plague was such a high death amount. So many people died, but eventually it stopped being so many people. It obviously waned after.
It did. And a lot of that was a lot of the population gained immunity to it. And a lot of it did have to do with weather patterns and the fact that the rats with the fleas weren't moving as readily as they were. And remember, it stuck around for 400 years. So it's not like it just kind of went away. It had its peak in those 4 years, but it stayed. The famous London, the one that people always talk about with Isaac Newton, developing calculus during a plague epidemic, that was still a derivative of the Black Death it was 1665. It stuck around for about 400 years before it finally kind of subsided. And then it will crop back up. Smallpox is the same thing. It's kind of this level, and then there'll be a peak, and then it'll go away for a little while, and then it'll peak again. These diseases are pretty crafty, and we don't ever quite fully defeat them.
Right. I'm kind of a history nerd about this part of it. I think I'm from European descent, and clearly I'm here today because my ancestors survived the Black Plague.
Absolutely. And if you look at
it's weird to think of it like that, but
it is. That mutation I was alluding to, that people that had it were protected against Black Death, that mutation, about 25% of all European descendants have that mutation right now. And what's really cool it could be a cool thing about this, is that it also partly protects against HIV randomly. That protein, it's called CCR5, was used by the bacterium that caused Black Death and is randomly used also by HIV. So they found people that had been exposed to HIV like 10 times and never contracted it. I'm like, what the heck is going on? They found that mutation. And it turns out that mutation also protects against bubonic plague. So
Weird.
it was a random thing that our ancestors passed, because I'm European descent as well, passed down to us. Now, unfortunately, the people that need that mutation are in sub-Saharan Africa for HIV, and
Right.
Black Death never made it to Southern Africa. So almost no sub-Saharan Africans have that mutation.
Mhm.
It's really only the survivors of the Black Death that have it.
It's just kind of crazy to think about it like that.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Okay, another question. COVID seems to take over the body after some people have recovered. Is there any other virus that works this way?
It's a great question. I can't think of, I mean, there are viruses that can stick around for your entire, I mean, HIV, I think would be an example where it sticks with you and then eventually your T cell count drops and you start getting sick with all these other things. But one, so kind of quickly after, I mean, it's not caused by a virus, but Lyme disease is a bacterial, is similar to COVID in that regard, where you'll have this initial infection, you think you took doxycycline and you feel better, and then 2 months later you have neuropathy. 5 years later you have neurological issues, and it never seems to go away. And in some cases they can't even find the bacteria anymore. They have no idea why people are getting these freak symptoms 2 years, 5 years, 20 years after they seemingly recovered from the disease, and they think it may be an autoimmune reaction. I'm thinking that COVID, we're going to see very similar things happening, where the virus possibly is gone, but you have these later effects that could now be immunological, that it's not necessarily the virus reactivating or anything. It's the immune system, some of the antibodies that were created start attacking the wrong things. And there are a lot of pathogens. Rheumatic fever is an example of a disease that's caused by that kind of thing, where the immune system gets confused and says, wait, these antibodies stick to this, so let me go attack that. And it's actually host tissue it's attacking. We don't know that that's the case with COVID. They actually think that is the case with Lyme disease, why you can have 20 years later, you're still getting neurological symptoms from it. They think it's the antibodies that's attacking host tissue for some reason.
Wow.
Yeah, great question.
What are the most important things you feel we can do as individuals during this time?
I mean, overall, just it's what we've been hearing on the news. Be smart. At this point, I don't think we need to be quarantined at the level we were in March, where we're not going out for anything. But wearing masks is so important, and I don't want to be one of those people, but I get really bothered when I see the people wearing it like this, and it's like there's no point to it. You're spewing virus all over the place if you have it. Wearing masks is extremely effective. If two people wearing masks, it reduces the potential of transmission by, I think they said like 97%. There's a great example of the hairdresser, I want to say it was Ohio, that had it, and there was like 200 people had come into that salon, and not one of them got it because the hairdresser was wearing a mask. Just use common sense. You know, don't look at politicians to give you, you know, what you should be doing with COVID. Look to the scientists, the epidemiologists. They study this for a living. Politicians have other things to worry about. They have economics to worry about. They have getting reelected to worry about. All of them. The health experts, this is what they do for their job. Some cases for 50 years. They know what they're doing. Follow their recommendations. Don't get into large groups. You know, I'm a person of faith. I've seen these, and I want to go to church again. I've seen these churches down in the South where there's 400 people in the sanctuary and no one's wearing masks. I'm thinking, this is a recipe for disaster here. Just use common sense. And hopefully the vaccine, it's not going to be here before the end of the year, but if I were a betting man, I would say by February, March of next year, it'll be at the point where we may be seeing it in the population. Because we're not gonna, you're talking distributing hundreds of millions of doses. We're not getting, I mean, the government can't do anything that efficiently. It's just not gonna be that widely distributed by December. it's just not. So just be careful until then.
Good advice for sure. Common sense should always rule, right?
Really. Yep.
Well, I was looking if you have any more questions. I really, really enjoyed this presentation. I love that it was such a meld between history. You know, I really didn't think about so many of the things that you brought up, and I want to thank you for that, and the economic and the social implications that these epidemics and pandemics have had. Just something I just never thought about. So it was wonderful.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's what led me to write the book. I'm like, they've impacted us, and people need to know about this for future issues. Yeah, so yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Well, that's a perfect segue because your book is available on Amazon. I'm going to do a plug for you. And they said there's going to be a paperback version will be coming out hopefully by the end of this month or early September. So if anybody's interested in 5 days, is that what you said?
Yep, yep, that's when it's released.
Okay. Well, I know that's going to be on my my wish list, I think, because I'd love to learn more. It's really great.
Thank you very much.
I really, really appreciate you spending time with us this afternoon and sharing all of this wonderful information.
My pleasure. Have a great night, everyone.
Great, thank you. And thank you all for attending.